Dzień dobry Państwu, witam Państwa bardzo serdecznie na kolejnym spotkaniu wokół książki wydanej przez nową markę wydawnictwa Uniwersytetu Jagiellońskiego, wydawnictwo bowiem. Chodzi tutaj o książkę Anglik, który ocalił japońskie wiśnie, Ingram i jego historia. Książka opowiada o Collingwoodzie Ingramie, czyli takim wręcz prototypowym angielskim dżentelmenie, który na początku XX wieku sprawił, że japońskie wiśnie odzyskały swój blask i w zasadzie to, co wiemy o japońskich wiśniach i to, z czym możemy dzisiaj się spotykać, mówiąc o japońskich wiśniach, zawdzięczamy właśnie Collingwoodowi Ingramowi. Moją gościnią jest pani Naoko Abe, japońska dziennikarka, autorka tej książki, japońska dziennikarka, pisarka i miłośniczka japońskich wiśni, z którą będę miał okazję porozmawiać o tym, dlaczego warto zainteresować się tą nieznaną szerszemu kręgowi odbiorców postacią i co jej zawdzięczamy. Hi Naoko, how are you?
Hi.
Naoko is joining us
fine,
from
thank you. Nice to meet you.
Naoko is joining us from London.
Yes, I live in suburb of London, but
okay.
It's okay.
Okay, and it's cold there as it is currently in Poland. So welcome in the minus temperature zone.
Yes.
Okay, I'd like to start our talk with a kind of a question, because in your early career, you specialized in political writing. You were, for instance, as I read in your bio, you were the first woman to cover the Japanese, the Japanese Prime Minister office, Foreign Office, and Defense Ministry. And I was wondering, why have you decided to write a book about an English botanist, an English gentleman botanist?
Why?
Why?
Well, I moved to Britain, in England, in 2001. So I've been living here in England for 20 years. And being a freelance, I left the newspaper in Japan when I moved. And I was writing about daily news for a while, but then I got interested in, well, not so much of botany, but the kind of a flower history. You know, the Great Britain has a history of, because of the British Empire in the 19th century. In the middle of the 19th century, when Japan opened up the country, you know, and of course Japan had been closed from the rest of the world for over 200 years because the shogun Christianity and so on. So anyway, when the country opened up hunters, because they were very much interested in plants, and so they brought a lot of plants and shrubs from Japan and China, because Japan is a very botanically very rich country, which we are not quite aware of. But compared to Britain, where the botanical landscape was destroyed by the Ice Age, 10,000 years ago. So that kind of history really interested me. You know, how the plants moved, and it's a human interest, not so much as of botanical history. So human interest, how they moved, what impact they had, and how they are. And the cherry blossom, which is a national flower for us, and the Japanese are, of course, we are crazy about cherry blossom, as you probably know. So the cherry blossoms, or cherry trees, also came in that context when the country opened up, and it was a little bit later than the other plants, such as hydrangeas or other flowers, which are blossoming in all of Europe now. so the cherry blossoms came probably the beginning of 20th, and it's because of Collingwooda Ingram, this English botanist and plant hunter who fell in love with Japanese cherry blossoms, and he decided that nobody knows about cherry blossoms in the West, in Europe particularly. So I'm going to be the expert of cherry blossom. So he went to Japan 3 times, cherry trees, and he brought them back. He didn't bring back the trees, of course, but he brought back the scions, branches, to graft them in England and plant them in his garden in Kent. He had a very big house and he was from a very wealthy family. So I was interested in that kind of historical context of how the cherry trees came and what impact it had. And then I discovered that there was this is where my political background comes in, I think, that cherry blossoms in Japan had Japanese have lived with the cherry blossom over 2,000 years. And then it meant a lot of different things to the Japanese. First it was for the farmers and fishermen, and then the people, ordinary people, also lived with the cherry blossoms. So and there was a lot of symbolism of the cherry blossoms, spiritual or daily and political meaning. And then at the beginning, in the 20th century, after Japan opened up in 1953, 58, 53, that period, it became sort of a political symbol, and then the political leaders used cherry blossoms to unite the country, because Japan needed to be strong, not to be colonized by the Western imperialistic countries, because that was the height of the Western imperialism. So cherry blossom was very skillfully used for Japan's modernization, to become a nation state. The modern nation state. Yeah, in my research.
Yeah, because this is really interesting part of your book.
So
it's really.
And then unfortunately, Japan did become quite a strong country, beating the Chinese and then the Russians also in 1904 and 5. There was a big war between Russia and Japan, but after that, it started, going on the militaristic path, and then that continues throughout the Second World War, Pacific War, we call it.
Yes.
And then cherry blossom played a big role in the war ideology, unfortunately. And so Ingram comes in as an English gentleman, and he was a Darwinian, a very interesting botanist, Darwinian. He believed in the diversity of species, and he just believed in diversity and evolution and things like that, so which Darwin advocated. And so in Japan, in the course of modernization, everything kind of, and then when it plunges into totalitarianism, it didn't happen overnight, of course, but cherry blossom is skillfully used. And in Japan, we used to have loads of different diversity of cherry varieties until the country opened up. But after, precious varieties were forgotten, because and then there was one variety which prevailed, and then was it was planted all over Japan as a symbol of modern Japan. And there are a number of reasons for that. I mean, it was, pretty, and it's called Somen Yoshino, Yoshino cherry in English. It was easy to propagate, and it was kind of cheap, and massive production line it was made, and they were planted all over the country. When the country won the war with China or with Russia, thousands of this variety were planted, and eventually the countries, over 70% of the urban cherries became this variety, this one variety. So I found it extremely interesting to discover that as the cherry diversity was forgotten in Japan and just one variety prevailed, the political values also became kind of singular. Mm-hmm. The country lost the diversity of values, and then militarism and commercialism and militarism and totalitarian ideology prevailed. So happened at the same time, which means, in other words, that the singularity of the cherry trees, cherry blossoms, the advancement of totalitarianism, sort of. So at the Ingram, this Englishman, comes to Japan when that was happening, and he gets deeply disappointed because he had hoped to find different varieties that he didn't have in his garden. Mm-hmm. But he couldn't, so he went to really deep in the mountains to find, which eventually he does find, some nice, group of leaders. He was invited to give a speech in Tokyo in 1927, I think, and gives a warning to the Japanese leaders. Don't forget your precious past or diversity of your cherry trees. Mm-hmm. So that was an interesting thing. An Englishman botanist comes with this idea of the varieties, diversity is important, and then he comes and he sees that the singular monotone scenery, as well as he mentions in his diaries that militarism and commercialism are prevailing in Japan now, and which is really disappointing, and so he got disillusions. But so I found it extremely interesting how these things merged.
Yeah, thank you for this short lecture, actually, because it is really important for our readers and for our listeners and viewers to understand that Japan, like the cherry blossoms, are not only, because in Poland they are just this kind of slightly cliched symbol of Japan with this kind of poetry, slightly kind of of this kind of dubious sort. I mean it's just a cliche, right? And you are kind of, by writing about Collingwooda Ingram, you're kind of recovering this kind of multi-layered story of the cherry blossom as a symbol and as a cultural artifact and as a political artifact as well. But I was wondering, because your book is also, you combine this kind of biological research or botanical research, the political background, with your personal story and your personal memories and your family memories regarding or including the cherry blossoms. Could you please let us know slightly more about your personal story or your family story and the place and the role of the cherry blossoms in your family life or family history?
Family life, well, I wrote about my family. My family was from the western part of Japan, and a little bit of the history. When I talked about the cherry blossoms history in Japan, mainly because I didn't want to bore the readers of just writing about the boring history of Japan, because cherry blossoms history goes back a long time, And in modern times, well, I grew up basically in Tokyo, so I grew up just seeing this one variety, someyoshi no variety. So as a Japanese, I didn't really know. Embarrassing to say, but I didn't really know that we had so many different varieties of cherry blossom, that there was a huge diversity of cherry blossoms, but then we'd forgotten about it. So, I mean, you know, we modern Japanese, the cherry blossoms are a symbol of new start, because things start, school and new companies. So April is for Japanese people, it's a new start. And so every step of one's life, you know, like starting from nursery, going to the primary school and secondary school, and then high school and university, and then a new job, and every significant point of your life is a memory with cherry blossoms, because the cherry blossoms are in full bloom, and so people take photos, and I did the same. So it's a very deep-seated image of cherry blossoms intertwined in one's life. But then, since I came to England in 2001, I started thinking, first of all, I was very surprised that every spring there are so many cherry blossoms. I said, wow, why in England there are so many cherry blossoms? And secondly, they were not the monotone variety. There were different varieties and different blossoms, different colors, and so therefore each variety blossoms at a different time, because slightly different time lag, you know, from one variety to another. So what's happening here in England is that one variety starts blossoming probably early March, and then when it finishes blossoming, and then another variety blossoms, and then another variety, and it continues until like mid-May. And I was like, wow, what? Started a bit of research, digging into this question that I had for a long time in 2015, yeah. And then very soon I found out that there was this man called Collingwooda Ingram, who had fallen in love with Japanese cherry blossoms at the beginning of the 20th century. And then it was really because of him that England and the UK now, all over UK, there are so many cherry blossoms, different varieties, and you know, it's stunning. So it was a very interesting discovery for me that this English man, plant hunter and botanist, crazy lover of cherry blossoms, was behind. I mean, it's no exaggeration to say that many cherry trees originated in this country, originated from his garden in Kent, in a little village called Benenden. You know, he had a massive collection of cherry blossoms in the 20th century, in the run-up to the Second World War, and throughout the Second World War. He had about, I think, well over 200 or maybe even 300 cherry trees, and over 130 different varieties of, you know, wild cherries and man-made varieties.
That's really interesting, because
mostly from Japan. Yeah,
especially your story, and your story you tell in the book is really interesting from the perspective of colonialism and histories of colonialism and post-colonialism, because usually there is this narrative that we're going to decolonize countries, or the countries usually non-Western, non-European countries to find those indigenous cultures, indigenous ways of living. And here this is more complicated because this is actually a man who is, as you can see in his images, in his photographs, you can see he's actually an epitome of a British kind of, you know, colonialist, slightly, you know, this kind of tradition of a gentleman, which is deeply rooted in this colonial heritage. How would you address this issue of those colonial paths? Maybe let's call them paths of those of the Japanese.
Well, I mean, he was he was one of the last Edwardian gentlemen, you know, from a very wealthy family, who became, his grandfather was the founder of the success newspaper called Illustrated London News in the Victorian time. So he, I mean, no way, by no means that the Ingram family was from the beginning the upper class. In fact, his grandfather was a son of a butcher in Lincolnshire. So yeah, he symbolizes the his grandfather benefited from the peak of British Empire. So Ingram was born in 1880, so kind of, you know, in the glory of British Empire. So, but he was wealthy. He didn't have to work. He didn't have to work for a living. So he had the time and the money, and he had the massive garden to plant cherry trees and to create a beautiful cherry orchard. But you know, that's the way it was, and so he could focus on his. I wouldn't call it a hobby because he was very professional and you know, he had a lot of expertise, and he was the real expert of the cherry blossom back then. And so there were other gentlemen like that, right? The remnants of the British Empire who were wealthy and had the money and the time, and some of them were experts of the universe, or constellations, or animals, or nature. So Collingwooda Ingram, a product of course, the British, if you want, if you like colonialism, the British Empire. But because of that, you know, yeah, it happened in that context. That it is interesting that he goes to Japan, and then he tells the Japanese, you know, don't forget the past, and so good for him. But unfortunately, the Japanese leaders didn't listen to him quite well. Some of them did, but some of the botanists or cherry tree experts in Japan who met Ingram had already been concerned about the loss of all these varieties, and there were some people who were trying real, but then, you know, the time, you know, this massive strong force of modernization, and the whole country was really focused on modernizing, becoming strong, and being, you know, emerging as a powerful country, to be kind of trying to be equal to the Western powers. I think they had to do it, and so there's no real motivation for the leaders to preserve the cherry varieties. That was not a priority.
Yeah, of course, yes.
But it doesn't mean that the people forgot about the cherry blossom. People always loved the cherry blossom. But so this is when modern variety comes in and spreads, and people accept it. And so probably most people didn't realize what went on, that the varieties were forgotten and all these things.
Yeah.
So I think it's important to know.
Yes. Because from this perspective, from what you've just said, your book is also a book, and as you've just suggested, the book is also about diversity in all sorts of ways: social diversity, cultural diversity, as well as biodiversity, which is extremely important today. Perhaps more than ever, in the context, of course, of the climate change. So
yes.
Could you please, do you know what is the impact? Is there a massive and substantial impact of the climate change on cherry blossoms? Do you know?
Well, if there's any impact on the climate change? Yeah, apparently yes, and Japan is no exception in the global warming, and so the cherry experts, scientists are saying that, you know, particularly in the southern part of Japan, there's a southernmost island called Kyushu. There's already you see, cherry trees, they have to have at least a month of cold weather before blossoming. When the buds are, you know, when the buds get ready to blossom, there has to be at least a month of cold weather below 5 centigrade, and that in some parts of the island, in the southern island, sometimes it doesn't happen anymore. So the cherry trees lose the chance to blossom. So that's a very worrying trend. And there's an impact.
Okay.
Already, and hopefully something's got to be done, because even in
please
Tokyo, the globalization, the summer is getting hotter and hotter. I can't be very good for.
Okay, so
not just cherry trees. Yeah.
Let's hope that there is another Collingwooda Ingram to rescue the cherry blossoms again, right? In the context of the climate change, because this is of utmost importance at the moment, right? Okay, so one last question for you. If you were to give one reason for people to get interested in Japanese cherry blossoms, what would it be?
Yes, cherry blossoms are no doubt very beautiful, and it's harbinger of spring after a long winter, and it gives hope. It gives people hope and you know, hope, and they are a symbol of peace and friendship and love, and so I do hope people appreciate it in that very positive sense, and that's how they should be, giving out message of peace and love and connecting people with each other and enjoying the blossoms and also diversity. But also I would like Polish people to know that in the course of history, cherry blossoms for us in Japan have long history, over 2,000 years, and the journey of that history wasn't that simple, and it was the history of cherry blossoms was not very you know, zigzag. It was a zigzag, and then it was sometimes used. It has a kind of a dark history as well. So just to know that what happened, and because I think it's important to know. I mean, not just for us, for Japanese, but for people that, you know, it's quite amazing what a flower can do to people, being used for political ideology, and then, I mean, towards the end of the war, you know, the kamikaze pilots were encouraged Japan was losing the war, but you know the leaders didn't want to admit it, and so many young boys were encouraged to fall like cherry blossoms, and they believed it, and it shouldn't have happened, and so they kind of, you know, this distortion of the symbolism of a flower is, I think it should be relevant to all humankind, and so I'd love the cherry blossoms to be loved by everybody in the world, and it's yeah, but I think we should remember the history of it as well.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much, Naoko Abe, for your interesting and exciting remarks about an unobtrusive flower, actually, which is easily perceived as a cliche of Japanese culture, which is only part of the truth. And this let's encourage our readers, our viewers, and our listeners to follow this zigzagging path of the flower throughout the ages. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Goodbye.
Bye-bye.